You are a slave within Caligula's palace. You have just been called to the dining chamber. Not to serve, not to clean. You do not know the reason. And that is the part that has kept you awake for 2 years. Not what he does when he is angry, what he does when he is in a good mood. The door opens. He is laughing. He sees you standing there. The laughter does not cease, and in that instant, you realize that whatever is about to happen has nothing to do with anything you have done. Gaius, Julius, Caesar, Augustus, Germanicus. The world knew him as Caligula, and he left behind one remark that explains everything that followed. Suetonius recorded it directly. Caligula said, "Remember that I have the right to do anything to anybody." He did not say it in anger. He stated it as a fact, as a man states the weather or the time of day. When he came to power in 37 AD, Rome celebrated. The reign of Tiberius had been suffocating, paranoid, cruel in the precise way that political fear produces cruelty. When Caligula arrived at 24 years old, citizens flooded into the streets. In his first months, he released unjustly imprisoned people, abolished oppressive taxes, and staged games that filled the city with relief. For a brief moment, Rome believed it had been saved. Then he became gravely ill near the end of 37 AD. No one knows exactly what the illness was. What everyone who was close to him recorded was what followed. The man who recovered was not the man who had fallen sick. Something that had been restrained was no longer restrained. Tiberius had seen it coming. Before Caligula ever took power, Tiberius reportedly said he was raising a viper for the Roman people. He had watched the boy grow up inside the palace. He had seen what lived beneath the surface. The illness did not create what came next. It stripped away whatever thin layer had been containing it. And the people who had no way out of that palace, the thousands of slaves who lived and worked inside those walls, were the first to understand what that meant. Caligula kept an executioner on constant standby inside the palace, not stationed at a prison, not assigned to a military post, positioned near the dining chamber, ready to be summoned at any moment during a meal. Suetonius recorded this without elaboration, because the fact itself required none. Guests came to dinner at the imperial palace. They reclined at the table. They were served food. They were poured wine. And at some point during the evening, prisoners were brought from the palace cells into the dining room, not swiftly handled and removed, handled slowly, deliberately, while the food was still on the table. Caligula watched. His guests continued eating. That was the requirement. Not to look away, not to excuse themselves, to remain at the table and treat what was happening beside them as an ordinary feature of the evening. He said it himself. He told people directly that watching suffering sharpened his appetite. He said it at the table, in front of guests, as a man might mention that he preferred his wine from a certain region. No one responded. No one could. Then there was the slave who took a strip of silver from a couch. The theft was small. The response was not about the theft. Caligula had the slave brought into the dining room while guests were present. He ordered both of the slave's hands cut off at the table. Then he had those hands fastened around the slave's own neck so they hung against his chest. Then he had the man walked in a slow circuit around every table in the room. A placard was carried before him, explaining what he had done. The guests watched him pass. The slave completed the full circuit. Then it was finished, and the evening continued. Every other slave in that room was still working, still carrying dishes, still refilling cups. They moved through that room with their eyes lowered and their hands steady, while a man walked past them with his own hands hanging from his neck. They had no choice but to keep moving, stopping, reacting. Showing anything on their face was its own kind of risk. That is what made Caligula different from the cruelty that came before him. It was not only what he did, it was the company he did it in. He required witnesses. He required the people around him to absorb what they were seeing and perform complete normalcy in response. The slaves who worked those dinners performed that normalcy night after night. They became experts at revealing nothing on their faces while everything around them fell apart. That skill was the only thing keeping them alive. The dining room was the private face. The arena was the public one. And what Caligula did in public followed the same logic as what he did at the table. He needed witnesses. He needed the horror to have an audience. During one afternoon at the gladiatorial games, Caligula grew tired of the scheduled entertainment. The trained fighters were removed from the arena. In their place, he sent whoever was available, the elderly and the physically weak, slaves from the palace household, men who had no combat training and nothing in their hands. Suetonius recorded this. Caligula watched from his seat while people who had no ability to defend themselves were placed into that space, and he observed the result with the same focus he gave to everything else he arranged. He had the awnings drawn back first.
The afternoon sun in Rome in summer is not gentle. He gave orders that no one in the stands was permitted to leave. They sat in the heat, and they watched what he had decided they would watch. And if anyone's reaction did not satisfy him, if the applause was too thin, if the enthusiasm appeared unconvincing, the consequences followed. There was a moment during separate games when a gladiator received his freedom through a gesture from another fighter. The crowd responded warmly. Caligula stormed from the amphitheater in visible rage. He had nearly stumbled on his toga on the steps going down, which made the humiliation worse. The crowd had honored the act of granting a man his freedom. That response, more than his own entrance, had drawn the warmest reaction of the afternoon. He did not forget it. He also had riders and performers punished physically if their work fell short of what he required. Not dismissed, not fined, beaten with rods or thrown into rivers. This applied in Rome and in the provinces. A performance in Gaul that did not produce sufficient praise resulted in the performers being flogged. The standard was unseen until you failed to reach it. Caligula once looked out at a crowd in the amphitheater and openly declared he wished all of Rome shared a single neck. Cassius Dio recorded it. He said it publicly to the crowd he was addressing. It was not a flash of rage. It was a statement of preference, a description of how he viewed the people around him, every single one of them. Caligula built a bridge of boats across the Bay of Baiae. It stretched nearly 2 miles across open water. He crossed it on horseback wearing the breastplate of Alexander the Great, which he had reportedly taken from Alexander's tomb. The spectacle was enormous. The purpose of it, most historians concluded, was the spectacle itself. But what Suetonius recorded about the celebration that followed is what belongs here. Caligula invited people to come aboard the ships and celebrate with him. They came. He was their emperor, and he had invited them. Once they were gathered away from the shore, surrounded by water, he had them thrown overboard. Some managed to grasp the rudders of nearby ships. They clung on. Caligula had boat hooks and oars brought out. He stood and watched as his men moved along the sides of the ships, using the poles to push people away from the hulls and back into the water. One by one, deliberately, he watched until they were gone. The men using those poles were oarsmen. They were slaves. They obeyed the orders they were given. Slaves in that world obeyed every order because disobedience was not a real option. But what those orders required of them was to push a drowning person back into the water and hold their place while that person died. This is the category of thing that living inside Caligula's service produced, not only surviving what he did to you, becoming the instrument of what he did to others. He did something similar with a gladiator during a sparring session. The man was practicing with Caligula in the arena. At a certain point, the gladiator fell, yielded, lowered himself to the ground in the recognized gesture of submission. The fight was over. Caligula drew a real blade and stabbed the man while he lay at his feet. Then he walked the arena with a palm branch raised, the symbol of victory. The man had surrendered. That was the moment Caligula chose. Submission was not safety. Doing exactly what was expected could be the thing that killed you. There is one incident Suetonius recorded that cuts differently from the others, not because it involved greater violence, but because of what it required from the people watching. Caligula had a man's son executed. Then he sent for the father that same day. The father received an imperial summons to dinner at the palace, and he came because refusing an imperial summons was its own kind of death. He sat at the table. He was served food. He was poured wine.
Then Caligula turned to him and told him to be cheerful, to laugh, to enjoy the evening, to perform contentment at the emperor's table on the same day he had watched his son die, and the father did it. Suetonius recorded this without further commentary. The man performed happiness. He laughed when it was required of him. He kept his grief entirely inside his body for the duration of that dinner, because the alternative was to join his son. As every slave working that table saw it, they moved through that room carrying dishes. They refilled the father's cup while he smiled at whatever Caligula said. They kept their faces still and their movements steady, and they did not allow what they were witnessing to appear anywhere on them, because they had been doing that for years by then, watching things unfold at those tables and making themselves invisible inside the act of watching.
This was the daily reality of the palace. Not only their own fear of what he might do to them, the unending witnessing of what he did to everyone around them, watching people endure unbearable things and display the opposite, understanding that the performance was the only currency available and having to perform it themselves every single day while serving the man who made it necessary. Caligula had a philosophy about this. He quoted it directly: "Let them hate so long as they fear." It was not an impulse he was acting on. It was a deliberate position, a calculated approach to the people around him. You have just seen what he did in public, at the table, in the arena. Before witnesses he forced to remain silent. What happened behind the sealed sections of that palace, the parts he kept from public record, was documented by those who had no reason to embellish. It was worse. The imperial palace had many wings. Most of them served familiar functions: dining halls, audience chambers, private quarters. But during Caligula's reign, Suetonius documented that certain rooms were transformed into something else entirely, something that had no precedent among Roman emperors before him. And as the treasury emptied, drained by his games, his spectacles, his projects, his daily excess, Caligula opened sections of the palace to paying visitors, not as a museum, not as a site for official functions.
He filled those rooms with women drawn from the households of Rome's most prominent families, wives of senators, wives of equestrians, women of status, of rank, of families that had served Rome for generations. They were not asked, they were ordered, and their husbands, who sat in the Senate and commanded legions and governed provinces, sent them in, because the alternative was to make an enemy of the man who decided whether they lived or died. The slaves who worked in those sections of the palace moved through it daily. They prepared the rooms, they carried messages, they cleaned afterward. Yet they existed within it as permanent witnesses who could speak to no one about what they had seen. And some of them were not only witnesses. Some of the enslaved women of the household were among those used in those rooms, with even less protection than the noble women who at least carried the weight of their family name. Suetonius also recorded what Caligula did at dinner after summoning a senator's wife from the table. He would leave mid-meal, he would return, and then he would recount to the table in measured detail what had taken place.
He assessed the woman in front of her husband. He pointed out what he found lacking. He compared her to others. He did this calmly, the way a man discusses a transaction that has ended to his satisfaction. The husband sat at the table. The husband listened, as the slaves serving that dinner kept moving through the room with their eyes forward, while the man whose wife had just been dismantled in words sat 2 feet away performing composure. They had witnessed versions of this before. That was the most unsettling part.
By then, they had seen enough that nothing startled them anymore. That kind of numbness is not peace. It is damage accumulated so gradually that the person carrying it stops noticing the weight. You are still in the palace. It is January 24th, 41 AD. 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days have passed since the streets of Rome filled with people celebrating the start of his reign. The marble corridors look the same as they always have. The lamplight falls the same way on the same stone. But you have learned to read this building the way you read a person's face. You know which sounds mean he is nearby. You know the difference between silence that is safe and silence that is not. Today, he attended the Palatine Games. He was in a good mood.
He watched performances, ate well, moved through the afternoon with the ease of a man who had no reason to expect the day to unfold any other way than he wished. Now he is moving through the covered passage that connects the theater complex to the palace.